we were speaking about the building of the Mishkan, that, as I've said many times, that the Mishkan itself is a replication of creation. The Mishkan itself was a microcosm of creation. The 39 creative activities with all the subcategories is all derived from the Mishkan, the building of the Mishkan. Whatever creative activities that were needed to bring about this edifice, for God's presence to dwell in it, those creative activities are the activities that we're not permitted to do on Shabbos. How do we know this? Because the Torah juxtaposes the prohibition of doing melacha, which means work, which is creative activity, to the building of the Mishkan. And one of the methodologies to understand, to interpret the Torah, is based on juxtaposition, because otherwise it has no relevance. Why does Torah associate the prohibition of doing creative activity on Shabbos with the building of the Mishkan? So from this, it's derived that what creative activity is not permitted, the creative activity that was needed to build the Mishkan. The Jewish people were chosen to be the people, to be the testament to the world that God is the creator of existence. As we say in Shamru B'nai Yisrael HaShabbos, which we say on Shabbos, Friday night before the Amidah, the Shemon Esrei, and we say it in the morning, Amidah Shachris, we say, Osi Beini Veinechem. It is a sign of distinction between me and you to the world, that you are special, you are my people. And therefore the gift of the Shabbos was given to us, not to anyone else. Therefore we have to be the testament to the world that God is the creator. As God created for 6 days, and on the seventh day he refrained from creation, we being his people, he gave us this sign of distinction. We are the testament to the world that God is the creator. And therefore a Jew who does not observe the Shabbos, he's considered a heretic. Why? Because being the testament to the world is essential. As I always say, if you believe in the creator, there was an objective in creation. If you believe the world came about, it was just random, so then there's no rhyme or reason. But if there's a creator who created such a magnificent existence, universe, with the galaxies and everything goes along with it, evidently there was an objective and a purpose for this creation. Therefore, we are the testament that God is the creator, and he created, and there is, as a result of that, there is an objective in creation. There is a God. So if a Jew does not observe the Shabbos, and he acts within the context of being creative, doing these various creative activities, he's denying that God is the creator. And therefore it's as if, the Talmud tells us, he's denying, he's rejecting the Torah in its entirety. A person doesn't keep kosher, it's one detail. But this is the all-encompassing basis for belief that God exists, that God is the creator. That's the Talmud. So, as I said, it's a sign of distinction. Why is it a sign of distinction? If the Midrash tells us that everything that happened at the time of creation is replicated in the Mishkan. For instance, there's a verse in Tilim which David says, Notea Shamayim Kayuriyo. He spread heaven like a curtain. So the Midrash says, just as we find there were curtains in the Mishkan, identically, the heavens are the equivalent of the curtain. Just as God said, let the waters gather and the dry land be seen, we find in the Mishkan, there was a laver, what we call the kior, which contained the water. And just as we find, this is the key, what happened on the seventh day of creation? On the seventh day creation, it says, God entered into existence. And when he entered into existence, all existence was illuminated. So God is the illumination, that is the life throb of existence, God being in existence. So when do you have that representation in the Mishkan? That is the menorah. The menorah which illuminates, that is the equivalent of God entering into existence. That's the corresponding factor in the Mishkan. And it goes to show how there's a corollary between the creation and the Mishkan. So we had said in the past, we find that the 4 exiles that Jews will eventually experience are alluded to at the beginning of creation. The Babylonian exile, the Persian Mede exile, which we experienced on Purim, that was the closing, that was the end of that exile. Then we have the Greek exile, which was during the Second Temple period. This was the Hanukkah period. That was the midpoint of the Second Temple. And then the destruction of the temple by the Edomites, which is the descendants of Esau, that was still experienced until today. And we find at the beginning of creation, each one of these exiles are alluded to. Where do we find they're alluded to? When the Torah says, what was the state of existence initially? It was Tohu. Vavo, v'choshech al pnei sodom. It was Tohu means it was unformed. It was chaotic. It was darkness over the deep waters. So it says Tohu, that's alluding to the Babylonian exile. Vohu, that's the Persian exile. Choshech, darkness of the Greeks, as it says, because they blackened our eyes with their decrees. Over the deep waters, the longest exile, which we're still experiencing now, is the Edomite exile. Just as the waters, the deep waters have no end to them, as it seems to be, identically, this exile is endless. It doesn't end. We haven't seen the end yet. It's over 2,000 years. So we find that initially in creation, anything that eventually will happen already is the DNA of creation. And therefore it's alluded to at the beginning. And the Torah says, what is the objective of this creation? For the sake of the chosen, the choicest. What's the choicest in existence? The Torah is the rachis. That's the choicest. And the Jewish people are called rachis. Also, we are the first of the tithing of the wheat. Rachis to us, we're the quality of the wheat, which is wheat. There are 5 species of grain. The most quality of the grain is the wheat, rather than barley, rye, all the others. Wheat is the choicest of all the grains. We are that among the nations. The Mishkan was what? What was the original intention of creation? That God should be in heaven or God should be together with man on the terrestrial level. The original intention of God was he should be on the terrestrial level. And initially he was together with Adam in the Garden of Eden. He gave him a charge. Do not eat of the tree of knowledge, which is good and evil. All the trees of the world, of the garden you could eat of, but this tree not. And he violated it. And he allowed that evil, which is the most lethal aspect of evil, to intermingle in himself in all existence. God ascended and removed himself from this existence. So the initial intent of creation was aborted, so to say. It was aborted. When did it come back into being? When God said, temporarily it was at Sinai, God brought heaven to earth, but to begin the relationship on an ongoing basis, this was the Mishkan. Make for me that sanctuary, I will dwell in its midst, in your midst. This is the relationship where the terrestrial has relevance to God's presence. That was the Mishkan. Therefore, the Mishkan itself is a replication of existence, because that was the intention of existence initially, that God should dwell in the terrestrial, not in the celestial, together with the human being. This is the Mishkan. And we find the Mishkan itself, as Ramban points out, that all the elements that existed at Sinai were represented in a smaller scale in the Mishkan itself. For instance, we find there was fire at Sinai. Gold has that same hue as fire, same color as fire. We find the Shekhinah, divine presence, was at Sinai. God spoke to us at Sinai. God communicates through the cherubs of the ark to Moshe Rabbeinu. As he spoke to Moshe at Sinai, he speaks to Moshe in the Mishkan. So we find literally all parallels, the Mishkan to what? To Sinai. And we find the parallel of the Mishkan to creation. Therefore, everything regarding what's considered observing the Shabbos, not observing the Shabbos, is what? is the creative activities. If you behave and act as God did, he was created for 6 days and he refrained on the seventh day. If we do the same, we're a sign to the world. That's the sign of distinction. But based on the Midrash, it's a whole different understanding. It's not we were chosen to be the testament to the world. It's much more than that. What happened on the seventh day? God entered into existence to have a relationship with the Jewish people. That's the only one he has a relationship with. This intimate, because who are we? We are the Adam. Adam was disenfranchised. Who was installed to be his equivalent? The Jewish people. When we said Nasiv Nishmat Sinai, we accepted the Torah unequivocally at Sinai, we became the Adam. We became that special human being who had the capacity to be able to have a relationship directly with God. Now, what is Shabbos? As we just said, God entered into existence and the whole existence illuminated. It started to glow, to radiate. That's Shabbos. And that's why the Talmud tells us that Shabbos is Mein Olam Haba. Shabbos is a semblance of the world to come. Although it seems to be a regular 24-hour day, but it's not. In its essence, although it's in this existence, it's the equivalent of the world to come. What is the world to come? You have a relation with God. It's the most intimate, which we can't relate to. Whatever that is, we have no idea what that is. Shabbos is a semblance of that. And that's why Shabbos is the holiest day. Shabbos is the holiest day of the year, of any holiday, especially Shabbos. Why? Because God enters into this existence. The Talmud, on Yom Tif, when we conclude the bracha in the Shmon Esrei, we say, Mekadosh Yisrael Vazmanim. God sanctified the Jewish people, and we have the ability to sanctify time. We sanctify time. What about Shabbos? The Jewish people don't sanctify the Shabbos. Baruch Ato Hashem Mekadesh Shabbos. God sanctifies the Shabbos itself. Shabbos happens by itself. Why? And the Talmud tells us Shabbos, the innate holiness of Shabbos, goes back to the beginning of creation. And every week on the seventh day, it repeats itself. God re-enters Saturday night, he exits. The next seventh day comes, he re-enters into existence. This is unrelated to us. So that he re-enters and he has a relationship with us, that's the os. That's the sign of distinction, because the only one he has that relationship with is only the Jewish people. And that's the os hi beinu v'nechem. This is the sign of distinction. Who has a relationship with God? We say Shema. We say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu. The Almighty is our Almighty. What do it mean? It's our Almighty. What are we talking about? The personalization. God is the master, is the God of all mankind. It's true, he is. He's the creator, all mankind are his subjects. But that relationship, that personalization that he has with us, he has with no one else. That's Elokeinu. God is our God. But that was confirmed at Sinai, it's Osi Beinu V'nechem. Shabbos is a sign of distinction between me and you, because you're the only ones who have that relationship with. This Me'en Olam Haba, that is a semblance of world to come, that to be able to cleave and be attached and have that level of intimacy, there's only the Jewish people, this is not the world at large. The world at large only has relevance to God through the Jewish people. If they themselves, as we'll discuss in a moment, they assist and accommodate the Jew, then they are able to have a relation with God through us. We are the medium, as the Mishkan is a medium for us to have a relationship with God. The Jewish people are the medium for the world to have a relation with God, but it's only through us. By accommodating, facilitating various situations that we ourselves should be able to serve God and to assist us, then they have a relationship or relevance to God himself. If not, they have no relevance to God, although they are God's subjects. So the Elokeinu is what? The personalization is due to what? That was confirmed with the Shabbos. That's the Osi. This is the sign of distinction between ourselves and God himself. A non-Jew is not permitted to observe the Shabbos. Is not permitted to observe the Shabbos. Why? So the Midrash says, what is it analogous to? A king and queen are having a conversation between themselves, and the third party eavesdrops on that conversation. What does that person deserve? So the Mishnah, doesn't he deserve to be put to death? Would you have the audacity to eavesdrop on the moment of intimacy, that private conversation between the king and the queen? So the non-Jew observing the Shabbos, trying to mimic the Jew, wanting to so-called infringe, to cross that line, which he has no right to cross the line. Therefore, it's something which is considered something very grave if the non-Jew attempts that. Give you an example. We find that Sinai, the Jews were told they should encircle the mountain, but they weren't permitted to approach the mountain because the mountain is holy. The only person who was permitted to ascend the mountain was Moshe, but the people themselves weren't permitted, because to have that relationship with God's presence, it's only if you're at that special level. That is exactly what the Shabbos is. The Shabbos being Me'ein Olam Haba, it has a semblance of the world to come. The only one who's permitted to enter into that sanctuary, which is through observing the 39 creative activities, because as God himself refrained on the seventh day from being creative, we too, the sign of distinction is we have to be God's representative. To be able to have that relationship, we also have to wean ourselves from the physicality of the world, and that's the 39 creative activities. We had recently in the Ramchal and Derech Hashem, Way of God, where it said, what is the challenge of a human being? That although we're physical beings and we're involved in the physicality of the world, despite that, we have to adhere and we're bound by the dictates of God. And that's part of the challenge. Give you an example. We find that Yom Kippur, there is a Torah obligation. The Jew is not permitted to eat or drink. The other areas of deprivation are only rabbinical. Not to wash, not to anoint yourself, not to wear leather shoes. That's all rabbinical. But eating and drinking, that's a Torah violation. If one eats or drinks on Yom Kippur, it carries very serious liability. One carries the liability of kares, spiritual excision. The others not, they're only rabbinical. That's Yom Kippur. Now the question is why? Why do we have to wean ourselves from all aspects which are the basic amenities of a human being? Eating, drinking. That's a need. It's a human need. Bathing, anointing oneself, procreation, wearing leather shoes, all this, these are all functions of basic amenities of a human being. Torah says when it comes to Yom Kippur, you must wean yourself. You must deprive yourself from that. It's not permitted. And that's called affliction. You must afflict yourself on the 10th of the month, the 7th month. That's Yom Kippur. What's the idea? So the Talmud tells us, just as an angel doesn't eat or drink, we on Yom Kippur are not permitted to drink. Just as an angel does not procreate, we don't procreate. We don't engage in the act of procreation on Yom Kippur. Just as the angel has no relevance to bathing, anointing himself, the angel, we too. So just as the angel speaks Hebrew, Lashon HaKodesh, which is God's language, the holy tongue, we speak Hebrew. The Jewish people, we speak Hebrew. And that's why it's best to pray in God's language, which is Hebrew. Just as the angel stands and doesn't sit, there is a special to be able to we stand on Yom Kippur more than any other day of the year. We stand. So we should take on the persona, the profile of an angel. That's what it is. But factually, a person who engages in this format, in this profile, you experience the day differently. When we wean ourselves from physicality and we immerse ourselves in spirituality, we internalize and we're touched by the reality of that day. It's a different day. We feel the solemnness of the day. We feel the holiness of the day. Shabbos itself, God says, all week you're involved in the mundane, and that you and because of that, there are challenges. Shabbos comes Shabbos, you're not permitted to do even creative activities, even for the sake of food preparation, which on Yom Tif, on the festivals, you're permitted. Shabbos, no. You have to fully detach yourself from physicality. The focus is only God himself. It's having that relation with God. Can you imagine a person has a Havdil Elf Havdolas? You get yourself an appointment with Warren Buffett, and he has an hour of time to give you, and he's going to advise you in finances. and you say in the middle of and you have exactly an hour. He says an hour and not a second more than an hour. Say, oh, by the way, I think we should order in something from, Starbucks. We should at first enjoy it there, and before you turn around, the time is gone. If you understand the value of picking his brain and being advised during that hour, you're not going to get him from Starbucks or anything else. Well, what about Russian caviar? What about this? Do you understand what's going on right now? Shabbos is a semblance of the world to come. You can't be involved to any degree in the what? In the mundane, in the physicality, the material of the world. You have to detach yourself. Of course, we eat, and there's a mitzvah to eat and enjoy the Shabbos because we celebrate that relationship with God. But outside of that, creative activities, on no circumstance are you permitted to engage in that. For that reason itself, because we have that relationship. That's the main on the Mabah. The Mishkan itself was the equivalent of that continuously, but that was through the medium. And therefore, the Talmud tells us, we find, which we're going to read in 2 weeks, on the 8th day, when the Mishkan took on a permanent status, when the divine presence entered into this existence, God's joy at that day was the equivalent of joy when he created the world. When he created the world, he entered into existence to have a relationship with the human being. The Mishkan, the 8th day, when Aaron and his sons were installed as Kohanim, and the divine presence entered into the Mishkan, God's joy was no less. It was the equivalent of that. Because again, as we discussed, this is a replication of existence. This is existence. God existing on the terrestrial level to have a relationship with the human being, with the Adam, which are the Jewish people. We've discussed this many times in the past, just putting it all together now. Okay, that's the understanding. We find that the Torah tells us God took Adam and he put him in the Garden of Eden. Now, when we speak about the word he took, always, taking, if you talk about an inanimate object, you take an object. You talk about an unintelligible creature, you take the creature. A human being has a mind of his own. You don't take him. You ask him, you present it, you try to encourage him. What God took him and put him into the Garden of Eden. Or we find God says to Moshe, Kach es Aaron, take your brother Aaron and install him as a Kohen. But he physically took him and installed him. So Rashi cites the Midrash, Kochel b'dvorim, through the power of persuasion. Persuasion is taking a person. So what did Hashem say to Adam initially when he created him? The opportunity I'm giving you now, I've created this whole existence for you. And if you succeed in this opportunity, it's eternal. It's not to be described what the value of that is. And therefore, as we say, Ashrecha, you're fortunate to have this opportunity. And this is one of a time kind of opportunity. Nothing compares to this opportunity. So when a person hears that, as they say, it's an offer I can't turn down. That's persuasion. You're persuaded. Persuasion means normally what is choice? Choice is you have you have a choice. There's an alternative. If somebody is so convincing that one side outweighs the other, it totally obstructs, obliterates the other. There's no consideration. As they say, it's an offer you can and can't turn down. So the power of persuasion is you take the person. You've taken away the person's choice, that the person has no choice but to accept. When Moshe installed Aaron as the priest, as the high priest, as the Kohen Gadol, he gave him the understanding this is something he could have been and he should have been. Because he misspoke, he actually forfeited that right. To be the efficiency of God, to go into the Holy of Holies, whatever that is, to represent all the Jewish people, to bring about atonement, so on and so forth. That's kach, being presented to him in a way where he will understand it's something he cannot turn down. That's the power of persuasion. As I always say, in English, when it's always used in the negative context, I've been taken. Always in negative. I've been taken. A person's duped, he's been taken. What does that mean, you've been taken? Because it was presented in a way that you misled, that you didn't see the minefield. You didn't see it. That's how convincing it was. But in the positive, That's called persuasion. You've presented in a way to show and explain what it is to the person, and that's kocheyu. When Hashem took Adam, he put him in the Garden of Eden, and he communicated him to understand what that reality is. But you understand, we find that by Sinai, God put the mountain over our heads. And we've said, the Talmud tells us that Sinai was in a state of coercion. We were compelled, we coerced. We didn't have choice. So Rameh Simcha of Dvinsk explains, the level of clarity of Sinai was so absolute, we had no choice but to accept, meaning there was no alternative. When a person sees something that clear, it's not you've chosen. You have no choice. Therefore, that's called under coercion. What happened at Purim? Purim, that we read in the Megillah, this word says, Kimu v'kiblu. It was a reaffirmation of what they accepted at Sinai. It was a Kabbalah mi'ava. It was their choice to accept due to what they had seen. They saw God's love for them, that they were at the point of extinction, and they could have been annihilated, not to be a trace of a Jew left on the face of the earth. And God at the last moment goes and he overturns the decree, and our enemies are killed, and we're so-called the heroes. And it's revealed that Esther's a Jewess, and Mordechai is her uncle, and he's installed, and he's appointed to be the viceroy in the place of evil. This is something not to be believed. But this is something the Jews saw. That was their choice. It wasn't something forced upon them, meaning due to absolute clarity. Therefore, that's called Kabbalah mi'ava. They accepted out of love. They weren't taken. That's based on the way they processed and they saw it. That was their own initiative to say, we want to reaffirm our relation with God, because now it's our choice. We could have seen differently, but we see it correctly. And therefore we accept. That's what it is. During the week, the challenge is very difficult. You go to work, you're involved in the thick and thin of material success, whether you're wealthy, poor, but it's making ends meet to some degree. Distraction, not to be believed, the level of distraction you have. Despite that distraction, within that darkness, so to say, within this turmoil, this confusion, you have to have a level of clarity. You still have to remember who you are, what your responsibilities are, what's primary, as it says in Pirkei Avos. What is the primary, what's secondary? Is this primary, or is something else primary? Is this to facilitate the primary or something other than that? Maintaining that focus and that cognizance, that's the challenge. Shabbos comes, Mein Olam Haba. God says, I want to give you a setting, a mindset, emotionally. You should only focus on what it is. Therefore, no creative activities permitted whatsoever, because the day itself is a day of a relationship. It's a semblance of the world to come, which is a relationship with God. Therefore, you have to wean yourself from all the physicality of the world, which is the creative activities. That's the sign of distinction, because only the Jew has that level of relationship. No other nation has that level of relationship. And anybody else who tries to cross that line, it's like the commoner wanting ascending Mount Sinai, where only Moshe was permitted because God's presence was at Sinai. So the Shabbos itself is a semblance of Sinai. God's presence was at Sinai, only Moshe could ascend. Once we became a Jewish people, Shabbos is the Sinai of the week, which repeats itself every 7 days. Only the Jew is permitted to enter that edifice called Shabbos, and therefore we ourselves assume that relationship and re-energize. We reconnect every Shabbos during that. And what do? There's a Torah obligation. You know, it's interesting. Women are not obligated in any positive commandment, which is determined by time. Time-oriented positive command, a woman's exempt. Kiddush Friday night, although it's a positive commandment, it's in the first 10th commandment, set of tablets, Zochas Yom Shabbos Lakacho. Remember the Shabbos to sanctify it. A woman has no less an obligation than a man, although it's a positive commandment. And it's linked to the negative commandment. Just as negative commandments, there's no difference between a man and a woman. And it says, Lo sasko malochi, not permitted to do any creative activity, which even applies to the woman. And the Torah links the positive to the negative. Therefore, the woman is no less obligated than the man. Sanctify the Shabbos. What is it? Again, this is, of course, in terms of cleaving and attaching, have their relationship with God, there's no difference between the Jew and the non-Jew, between the man and the woman. No difference. As the man cleaves, has a semblance of the world to come, and this is experiencing what ultimately we will experience, the woman being a Jew, no less than the man being a Jew, she has an obligation to acknowledge that. How does she acknowledge it? By the declaration over the wine. Over that cup of wine, remember the Shabbos sanctum, Zachrei al Yaim. So I pointed out, there's a question, what exactly was the fruit of the tree of knowledge? According to one opinion, it was the grape. And the Chaim HaKodesh cites the Zohar that Adam ate of the grape, and if Adam would have withstood the challenge and not eaten of that fruit, Friday night he would have taken that grape, squeezed it, and he would set Kiddush on that cup of wine. Now, what do we do Shabbos? We being the replication of Adam, who he was supposed to be. We are the Adam. We are the one chosen to have that relationship with God. What was Adam supposed to do when he brought the world to that level of completion, perfection? To say the benediction over the wine, that's what he was supposed to do. That was like the victory. That was the victory drink. So we Jews, what do we do Friday night? Zachrei al Yayin. We say the Kiddush, which is a Torah obligation, positive commandment, on that cup of wine, and there's no difference whether it's the woman or the man. She has no less of an obligation. Because this is the man that's called Adam. We replaced the original Adam, creation of man. The woman is the Chava. She is the woman who's supposed to be the helpmate to bring the male to his level of completion together, in unison. It's one unit. That's what it is. Now, we had discussed that when the Torah tells us, it speaks about the materials that were needed for the Mishkan. Zov, kesef, nechoshes. Gold, silver, copper. Then it says red dyed hides. Hides that were dyed red. A ram's hide dyed red. So the Midrash says gold represents the Babylonian exile. Silver represents the Persian exile, Persian and Mede. The copper represents the Greek exile, and the ram's hides dyed red represents the Edomites, which are red. Esau was red. So we find this correspondence here. Just as initially in creation, there's a representation in the DNA of creation, there was a place for this to evolve and happen at a certain point in history. Identically, there is a representation in the Mishkan of the four exiles. Because again, as we said, because the Mishkan itself is a replication, is a microcosm of existence. And whatever was part of existence, the original intent of existence, identically, that is what the Mishkan was. We had said, at the beginning of Vayikra, it says, God called to Moshe. So Rashi cites the Midrash. What was the level of audibility of God's voice when he spoke to Moshe? Did he speak to him in the whisper? Because nothing was heard outside of the tent. He told him to go into the communion tent and he spoke to him. What was the level of that voice, of God's voice to Moshe? So Rashi cites the Midrash that, as we say in the Mizmor LeDavid, Kol Hashem b'moyim, Kol Hashem shovei arozim, the voice of God smashes mountains, overturns the world. That was the power of that voice. Sinai, we understand. Sinai, there were millions of Jews there. So God, the audibility of God's voice had to be at a level that the millions of Jews had to hear God speak. That's why it had to be that level of audibility. But the Mishkan, why did God have to communicate? Every communication with Moshe was at that level of audibility. And God gave him the capacity to be able to absorb that level of audibility. Why? If he's only speaking to Moshe, speak to Moshe at that less level of audibility. According to the Ramban, that the Mishkan is a replication of Sinai. At Sinai, in what level did God communicate? It was Kol Hashem. Whatever Kol Hashem is, whatever the sound, the voice, the audibility, that Mishkan's the same thing. And that's how Torah was communicated to Moshe Rabbeinu, with that level of audibility. No less than that. Okay? Now, we read in the Mishkan, in the Torah, that, and the Ramban makes a point of this, what was the background of the Jew in terms of ability of craftsmanship, artisans? Our background was mortar and brick. Now, how do you have a person whose background is mortar and brick, all of a sudden, they are the most advanced craftsmen and artisans, creativity, ability, most delicate type of work, goldsmithing, silversmithing, copper, cabinet makers, dyers, weavers, the finest, not a mistake. Everything is done perfectly. How does this happen? It was a miracle. What was the miracle? So the Torah tells us, in the heart of every heart that contained wisdom, God added wisdom. It was an endowment. It was a miracle. Miraculously, God gave every person the ability to function, the capacity he chose to offer his service, whether it was gold, silver, copper, cabinet making, dyeing, weaving, whatever it is, spinning the wool, whatever it may be. It was the most advanced level of ability. How did it come? In the heart of everyone who contained wisdom, he gave wisdom. So the Gemara tells us, it doesn't say he gave wisdom into the heart of everyone. In the heart, every heart that contained wisdom, he gave wisdom. So the Gemara says, what does that mean? Only the person who already had wisdom in his heart, did he give wisdom to that person. If the person did not have wisdom in his heart, he did not merit this endowment. So it's always a tributary of Chaim of Volozhin. So where does it begin? So how do you have that initial wisdom in the heart? It was only in the heart that had wisdom, God gave this wisdom. So Chaim Volozhin explains, the Gemara tells us in 2 locations, everything is predestined except one thing. Whether you're going to be wealthy, poor, healthy, infirm, brilliant, wise, foolish. Every aspect of a person's life is predestined, except one thing. Tzaddik v'rosha, whether you be righteous or evil, that's not predestined. That's up to every individual. Every individual has the ability to take the initiative and go to either direction. He goes in the positive direction, that's available to him. Negative, that's available, whatever he chooses. As a result of that, David Bell says, Reishis Chochma Yiras Hashem. What is the beginning of wisdom? Fear of God. That's up to you. So the person who chose to have that wisdom, which is the fear of God in his heart, God endowed that person with that special ability. The person did not have sufficient fear in his heart, God did not endow with that ability. It's interesting. This explanation is attributed to Chaim Volozhin. But the Balaturim, in this last week's reading, in Tetzaveh, the Balaturim says, Ubalev Asher, B'chol Leiv Asher, those 3 words, B'chol Leiv Asher, in every heart that, the numerical of those words are Yiras, fear of. So the Balaturim says, what does it mean? Ubalev, Ub'chol Leiv Asher, in every heart, Asher, Yiras, he cites the pasuk, the verse in Tehillim, Reishis Chochma Yiras Hashem. So the Balaturim is actually saying where Chaim Volozhin says. Balaturim is an early commentator. If you have that fear of God, you have the capacity to receive that endowment. If not, you didn't qualify. That's what it was about. Okay? So who has the ability to replicate and create something which is the equivalent of existence? Only the person who has reverence of God. You have that, then is what to talk about. So you can only be in a position to replicate God's existence, which is creation. As we showed, the Mishkan was a microcosm of existence, only if you have that initial qualification, which is called fear of God. You have fear of God, then God gives you the endowment. If not, he doesn't give you the endowment. Okay? I mentioned, we read yesterday who officiated for the 7 days of initially before the Mishkan took on a permanent status, Moshe. Moshe officiated, and he was actually installing Aaron and his children to be qualified to be installed on the 8th day. This was part of the initiation. The initiation was a 7-day initiation, brought certain sacrifices. He put oil and blood on their garments or whatever, on the ear, on their hand, on the thumb, whatever it was. But that was initiating them that when the 8th day comes, he'll be able to install them as the Kohanim, as the officiants of God. Every day he would erect the Mishkan, dismantle it, erect, dismantle. On the 8th day, it was erected, take on a permanent status. God enters into the Mishkan. Okay? So the Gemara asks, the Talmud tells us that if a Kohen officiates without priestly vestments, the service is not valid. Only if he wears priestly vestments. Without priestly vestments, it's not a valid service. And in the words of the Talmud, it says, Bigdeim aleim kunas habaleim. If they're wearing the vestments, then their kuna, their priesthoods upon them. Otherwise, they're not seen as priests. It's like a person who's not a Kohen officiating. It's not valid. But they need those vestments. Which vestments? The vestments which we read in yesterday's reading. The high priest has 8 vestments, very specifically. They have to be made to meet God's specifications. The ordinary Kohen wears the white vestments, which are all 4 vestments. Okay? Now, so the Gemara asks, when Moshe officiated, did he wear vestments? So Gemara says, Talmud says he wore a white tunic. Okay? This is a little bit of review. So the Shalach Kodesh writes, what does mean wore white tunic? Now, initially when God created the human being, we read the story in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were naked. They were naked. And then the snake goes, seduces Chava, Eve, to eat of the tree of knowledge, and she gives it to her husband. And all of a sudden, they're ashamed of their nakedness. They're ashamed. And they hide. When they hear the voice of God in the garden, they go into hiding. So God says, why are you hiding? They said, because we're naked. He says, why are you naked? How do you realize you're naked? I mean, it was shameful. Did you eat of the tree that you shouldn't have eaten of? And this is how the dialogue began. Before, they weren't ashamed. Afterwards, they were ashamed. What was the shame? Could you imagine? You're invited to an inaugural ball, and you walk in with garments which are putrefied and give off a stench that anybody at the ball literally can't breathe. They become asphyxiated. That's how intense the negative stench is. You would have come 10 miles within that inaugural ball because you disrupt everything. What was the initial investment of given to man to serve God? What's the essence of the person? His soul. What is the body, the physical body? That is the vestment to serve God, to make your choices. That's how you serve God, with that vestment. What happened when they ingested the tree of knowledge, the fruit which is good and evil, evil at the most extreme, intense, lethal level of evil? That body became putrefied. It was no longer that pure vestment that was qualified to serve God. And with that vestment, you can have a direct relation with God. As a result of that, when they realized what happened, they had shame. Now that vestment, which was the ultimate, became something, there's no way to describe what it became. They were shamed. You hide it. You want to bury yourself. So the vestment, which originally man was endowed to serve him, became disqualified. So now what Aaron has to be the priest. He has to officiate. Even to enter the Holy of Holies, he needs special vestments for honor and for glory of God. He must wear these vestments. So these vestments are the equivalent, a replacement for the body. Because everybody, every human being from that moment going forward, their physicality was putrefied. You want to serve God at that special level where God has that direct relation with the human being, you have to wear special vestments. The body no longer qualifies. Therefore, God says to Moshe, these vestments have to be made for Aaron and his children, for honor and glory, to be able to have a relation with God, because these are the vestments. Moshe himself was so pure and so holy. His body was so pure. His vestment was his body. He could serve God at that most advanced level without vestments. His body was that original vestment, which still qualified and made the grade to serve God directly. Therefore, what did he wear when he officiated? During the 7-day period, he only wore a white tunic just to cover his nakedness. That's out of respect. But in terms of the function and the value of his physicality qualified because it was intermingled with his soul, and that's why he radiated, because he was so holy for that reason. Okay? So now, let's understand. When God created the human body for Adam, it radiated, and as it says, the angels have mistaken his radiance for God's radiance. The physical form of that body, physically, how many parts was that body comprised of? 248 parts. Ramach Evorim. Why did God choose Ramach? Why Ramach? Why 248? Because the 248 parts of the body correspond, as the Rav Chaim Vital brings in the name of the Arizal, because the 248 parts to the Jewish soul. So that vestment is the vestment of the soul. It addresses every aspect of the soul to be able to function, to address the needs of that soul. 248. That vestment, which is the body, became putrefied. You need another vestment to take the position, the place of that vestment. So as we said, the Mishkan is a replication of creation. What were the vestments? The vestments, according to Shalom Kodesh, is a replication of the body. So whatever those vestments, what did they represent? When Aaron officiates with those vestments, he represents what? He represents something which is equivalent to 248, which is in its original perfect state, in its purest state, as the body initially was, the vestment to directly have that relation with God. That's the covenant of Tiferes. Now you're in the image of God. God created man, Salmo Musa, in his image and his form. The covenant of Tiferes, the honor and glory of these vestments, is a replication of something which is equivalent of 248, which is the vestment of the soul. This is the new vestment of the soul. Okay? Now, it's very interesting. If you take a look in the Torah, the only time the Torah tells us that God endowed the person, the heart that had wisdom, it's only mentioned by the vestments. It's not mentioned by the Mishkan. You read the Parsha, do this, do that, whatever it may be. But then it says, when it comes to make the vestments for the high priest, the priestly vestments, which in L'chovot Tiferes, it says, I will give wisdom into the heart that contains wisdom. Only there, nowhere else. Why there? Why not anywhere else? So evidently here you need that special endowment. Because what is the totality of Torah? The totality of Torah is 248. That's the totality. That represents Adam, as the Maral says. Adam was labeled Adam because he was made from the earth. What is earth? Earth is potential. Earth is growth. You leave the most fertile earth fallow, it's just a clump of earth. But if you take advantage of its properties and its potential, all life emanates from the earth. All growth is earth. The human being, the Jew, has unlimited growth. That's Adam. That's the positive command. The positive commandments, those are advanced. Negative commandments is not to be diminished, but to advance, that's positive. Atem kurim Adam. So what are the vessels? Ramach. So what is the profile of a Jew? to identify that he's in the growth mode, that he has unlimited potential growth, 248. So those garments had to be, represents the equivalent of the 248. That's what they had to be. For that, you need that special endowment of wisdom. The world, that's physical. Of course, it's spiritual, but that's only to facilitate the person. But what is the essence of the, what we call the Tselem Elokim, the form and profile of God? That's the body. That's the human being. That's the vestment which accommodates the soul. The priestly garments are that. So why did you need that special level of wisdom? We find that King Solomon was the wisest man who ever lived in the history of existence. He was Chacham Mikol Adam, not to be fathomed. As I said, the Midrash tells us, cites a pasuk, a verse, that he was Kechol Hayom. He was like the sand on the beaches. What if he was Kechol Hayom? So the Midrash says the Jewish people are compared to the sand on the beaches, on the seashore. So the Midrash says if you take all the Jews and put them on one side of the scale, with all their wisdom and all their genius, and you put Solomon on the other side of the scale, he'd outweigh them. He was the equivalent even more than them. He was the equivalent. We're talking about unfathomable wisdom. This is divine wisdom. That's the wisdom we're talking about. But that's the world. To create the world, that's one thing. What about Torah? Even he, as great as he was, there was one statute, he says, is beyond my grasp. The Parah Adumah. The Parah Adumah was beyond his ability to even to enter and understand its dimension of value. So we mentioned that. What does the Orach Chaim HaKadosh explain? We find when we were in Egypt, we brought a Paschal lamb. There's no talk about if you're contaminated, you're not contaminated. That's only later. Why in Egypt? Why wasn't there a talk that if you're in a contaminated state, you're not permitted to partake of it? So he explains because before Sinai, what was our classification? We were Noahites. A Noahide has no relevance to spiritual contamination. He cannot be contaminated. He goes into a cemetery, comes in contact with the dead, cannot be contaminated. Therefore, the Paschal Lamb of Egypt, there's no talk about if you're contaminated or not contaminated, because we had no relevance. Zos Torah, Adam Kiyomas Bo'er. When did we assume that special level of holiness, that we have relevance that it could be contaminated? That was at Sinai. So that had to do with our new dimension of Jewish soul, which it says that even the greatest angel cannot fathom what the Jewish soul is. As a result of that, that's the basis for contamination. Why were we worthy of Torah? That's directly connected to what we became God's people at Sinai. So we'd explained, what is Torah? Torah is unlimited. It's infinite. It's God's wisdom. Because the contamination is a direct outgrowth of God giving his Torah to us, you have to understand the extent of what Torah is to be able to have an understanding of what that is. Why one is a consequence of the other. But Torah is not fathomable. The extent of Torah is beyond anybody's grasp. That only God knows that. Therefore, even Solomon, Shlomo Melech, King Solomon said, "Rechokim mimeni," it's beyond me. It's beyond my grasp. So now we're talking about what are the priestly vestments? They represent the body. What is the body? The body is 248. Why did God choose 248? Because the 248 components to the Jewish soul. And therefore, and what fuels, what gives eternity to the Jewish soul? The Chafetz Chaim says that a person, as much as you eat and you nourish yourself, the body, every day, it becomes depleted. Every day we have to reinfuse it with nourishment, or after every so much period of time. Eventually, the body has to be reinvigorated, renourished. Otherwise, the person will die, regardless of how much you was satisfied or nourished. It's irrelevant. If the Jew, he's meant to live for all eternity, what is the energy which lies in the mitzvah? It has to be eternal energy, because it has to invigorate and infuse the soul with such a level of vibrance that it lasts forever. That is the nature of every mitzvah. That's schar b'ayim al maleko. That's why there's no reward in this world. What is reward? Reward is what? Having that relationship with God who's infinite. And he's absolute in every sense of the word. To be able to cleave to that, that's not fathomable. Therefore, even King Solomon couldn't understand that. So what is Ramach? What is 248? The physicality of the body, that's 248, because that encapsulates what the totality of Torah is. For that, you need special wisdom. To be able to make that garment to be a representation of that. Not that they understood it, but to be able to create something in the physical, to be the equivalent of representation of that, you need a special endowment of wisdom. The Mishkan is a replication of the world, but it's not a replication of the person. The priestly garments, that's a replication of what the man was before he sinned, before he putrefied his vestment. That's something you need a special divine endowment of wisdom for that. And who has relevance to that. And it's Reishis Chach B'Yiras Hashem. The prerequisite to wisdom, and what's the ultimate wisdom, which is God's wisdom, which is the Torah, you have to have reverence of God. But that, because it's directly connected. The vestment is Torah, that's 248. For the Mishkan, which is the physicality of the world, or the spirituality, it doesn't make a difference. Its values only facilitate. But the essence of the human being, which is Ramach, which is 248, that's another level. Therefore, for that, you need a special endowment of wisdom to be able to create and process those priestly garments for that reason. Just to conclude, we discussed the menorah. It says that's Moshe had difficulty creating the menorah. Somebody couldn't figure it out. I mean, we have pictures. I mean, so we always explain, not about the physicality of the menorah. The menorah, to activate the forces that had to be activated, that we should have the energies to be able to bring about certain things, had the particular vessel had to be infused with that intent. What does the menorah represent? It represents the oral law. The oral law, it's illumination. It's the illumination, it's the elucidation of the written law. It's God's commentary on what he said. This is what I meant. That's what it is. Now that commentary is unlimited. It's unending. It's infinite. Moshe Rabbeinu was, great as he still was a finite being. So Moshe Rabbeinu could not fathom what exactly was the intent that he had infused that particular vessel, which represents infinite understanding. So what does God say? Just take the block of gold, just throw it into the furnace, and it came out a menorah. Now, it's interesting. But what did God have to tell them? Make it? Then he says, but I can't, it's too difficult. I can't fathom it. Why did he have to go through that process? So we mentioned the measures in the past. When Moshe Rabbeinu was 40 days and 40 nights in heaven, what was he doing? He was studying Torah. He was being taught Torah by God. So every day, God taught him Torah's entirety. At the end of the day, he forgot the Torah that he was taught. This process repeated itself 40 times. Finally, on the 40th day, he was able to retain it. So what exactly? I mean, if God allowed him to retain it, first to teach him the Torah's entirety in one day, it's a miracle. So, and as he retained it after 40 days, he could have retained it immediately after the first day. What was this process of going through the full Torah, forgetting, relearning it, and again forgetting it? The message was clearly communicated to Moshe. It has nothing to do with the human faculty. It has nothing to do with the human faculty. You could be brilliant, you'd have a retentive memory, but the physical, the Torah, that the information which manifests in the physical, this is only a symbolism, a representation of infinite spirituality. And the human being, without God's infusing you or giving you capacity, because we're physical beings, there's no way we can contain it or we can retain it. or process it properly, to have any degree of clarity on it. You need divine assistance. That was exactly the message of the menorah. Attempt to make it. As much as you are, as much as you know, now, you still can't infuse it. What do you? We all go through motions. Take the block, go put it into the fire. We have to take initiative. The Gemara says, Yogato Motzosa Tamin. You toil, you will understand. It'll be gifted to you. But if you don't meet the prerequisite of toil, God doesn't give you the gift. You have to show to what degree are you going to sacrifice for it. Sacrifice is always an indication of what? Of value. To what degree do you esteem? We sacrifice something that we value. Otherwise, we don't sacrifice for it. If we had to put the gold in the furnace itself, only then did it come out. We find also in this last week's reading, it says when they lit the menorah, how did they light the wicks? You would put the fire to the base and you kept it there until the flame went up by itself. He just didn't leave it and it went up by itself. He had to leave it there and then it went up by itself. Same idea. We take initiative. That illuminates afterwards, that's God's doing. There's a famous story with the Chafetz Chaim. You know, in Yiddish, the words which are very similar. There's a word in Yiddish, to do. How do you say to do? Tziton. That's how you say to do in Yiddish. Ufziton, that's to accomplish. To accomplish. Tziton is to do. Ufziton is accomplishment. So somebody comes to the Chafetz Chaim, he says, I planned to accomplish this. I plan to accomplish that. Can't. So Chafetz Chaim says, you better stop right now. Accomplish, that's up to God, whether you accomplish or not. To do, we can go through motions. Our obligation is to do. What the outgrowth of that is, that's up to God what the outgrowth is going to be. That's what life's all about. You find a person, he barely has a passable IQ. Whatever he touches, a Midas touch. A person has one of a kind of IQ, the man doesn't have two nickels to rub together. What is it about? It has to do with intelligence. You can only do the motion. That's all it is. We do. What the ramifications, the consequences, what that is, only God will make that determination, how far it will go. You know, it's interesting. You know, you throw something, you know, it says when you throw something in the water, there's a ripple effect. But let's say when you throw something in the water, it's true, due to you, the power that you threw it, will cause the ripples. What about if the current is going in the opposite direction? You're not going to have much ripples, right? Because the water is going the other direction. What about if the current is going the direction that you threw the object? The ripple effect is going to be much more. So what could we do? Our ability is limited to our ability. But to what the outgrowth of that is, there's so many other factors which determine what that is. And that's what life is all about. We have an obligation to do. We have to get up in the morning. We have to acknowledge, thank God that our souls will return to us. Now, what do we do with our day now? Why did God return our soul? To sit around and drink cappuccino and eat who knows what for breakfast, and to go read the financial page and whatever it is, and then go out and read the menu at who knows what, or call your chauffeur to pick you up at a certain hour. Is that what it's about? That's why God returned your soul in the morning. Evidently, it's much more than that. It's to do and to cause accomplishment. That's what it's all about. And the more we understand that, but how do you know what to do, what value is? That's why you have to study the Torah. You have to study, you have to understand what life is all about. And if you have the opportunity to study, the more we study, the more we understand. The more we understand and we do, the more worthy we become. The more worthy we become, the more we're worthy to be able, that God should bring accomplishment through our actions. To be continued tomorrow with Hashem's help. Everybody, any questions? Alan usually has a question. Alan.
No,
firstly, Shavua Tov, that's firstly.
Shavua Tov. A good Tavach. Very nice. After digested, it was a repeat a little bit of what the whole week was. It was in the Torah notes as well, the weekly Parsha. But it was it's a lot to swallow.
This is recorded on the computer. The whole share will be also on the website. You'll be able to download everything that I said today. Okay, everybody be well. We have Daf Yomi at 11 to 12 today.
Thank you, Rabbi. Be well.
Okay, good to see you, Larry. You too. Everybody have a Shua Tov, good Tvach.
You too, Rabbi. Thanks.
Be well. Take care.